Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started because we have a very full agenda and we don't want to cut any of it short. So again, I want to welcome all of you to REEF's quarterly webinar series. Next slide, please. So if you've attended one of our webinars before or watched our recordings online, I want to start out by saying that we're really excited today to do something a little different from our typical format. Usually REEF leads these conversations directly, but today we are intentionally turning the stage over to the team at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. CCSI is at Columbia University's Climate School. And as they were finalizing their recent research, we had the opportunity to talk with the authors who you'll hear from today about their findings. And we felt the work was important enough to amplify through our network and community. So that's what drove this webinar. And we're really excited that you're joining us today. The report that you'll hear about is titled The Refrigerant Circularity Efficiency Nexus: Sustainability Practices in the HVAC Industry. And what I particularly find compelling in this framework is that it brings health, circularity practices, and energy efficiency into the discussion with the essential actions on refrigerants that are needed to address climate change. And I was actually listening to an international cooling conference just this morning and was really struck by the way that we in the US often get siloed when we're kind of tackling problems. While many other countries are looking through a broader lens, they're talking about how fast to address financing, PFAS, training, and markets, while we're still debating refrigerant technology that's in use elsewhere. And this research illustrates the importance of embracing interconnectedness when it comes to refrigerants, especially if we want meaningful decarbonization outcomes. So today's event is designed as an interactive call to comment, if you will, rather than a traditional webinar. The CCSI team will guide us through the report section by section, and throughout the presentation, they'll invite all of you to participate through live polls, questions, and discussions. We really want this to feel collaborative and conversational. You'll also be able to access the recording on REEF's website. We'll post it alongside our past webinars on our site. And we're, again, really excited to have the team here with us, and we're looking forward to learning alongside all of you. Let me do a little bit of housekeeping before I turn it over. So if we could go to that next slide. I want to talk about how we're going to use the Google Meet platform today to really have this be interactive. Through the presentation, you're going to see some live poll questions appear on your screen. And to participate, you can follow the steps that we're showing here in the slide. And we will remind you of this later on, but just to give you a heads up on it at the beginning. So if you could look at the bottom right-hand corner of your Google Meet window, you can click on the small 9-dot menu icon. It looks like a little grid of squares. And what's going to happen is this menu that you see here on the slide is going to open up, and you'll see all of these buttons. And if you click on the button labeled polls, that's going to open a sidebar. And you can just keep that up during the whole webinar if you would like. You can close it down now and open it later if you'd like. But that sidebar is going to let you answer poll questions and see kind of a rolling live response to the poll questions as we go through. So that's also interesting. And as each new question launches, it's going to just appear in that sidebar. So you'll see it and can see the answers as I mentioned. I want to also let everyone know that the poll responses are all anonymous. So please answer honestly. And we really encourage you to participate in this way throughout the session. It's meant to be conversational, and this is a great way for you to provide feedback as we go. Next slide, please. So one final note, or a final way that we're going to use this is, of course, for Q&A at the end. So we will open the floor for a live discussion at the end where, if you would like, you can come off of mute, turn your cameras on, and share your comments or reflections directly with the rest of the group, including the speakers. And at any time during the webinar, as questions come to you or you want to share thoughts or comments, you can access the Q&A section. And if you see here in the slide, it's just below the polls button. So same, click on the 9 little squares, this menu pops up, click on Q&A, and then you can write it there. If you would like to ask your question directly, again, we'll have time at the end of the webinar. Please, after you write your question, just put your name and write live comment. And that way we can find you and you'll be taken off of mute and be able to ask your question and come off of camera if you'd like. So we hope that this really creates a more open and collaborative conversation around the report and gives everyone an opportunity not just to listen, but also to contribute to the dialogue. So now let me just quickly introduce the speakers and then we will be off and running. So first, Laura Garcia Cancino co-authored this report. She is a senior legal researcher at CCSI, where her work focuses on using law, policy, and metrics to support climate action and accelerate the energy transition. Laura is a lawyer by training with specialized experience in systems decarbonization. And before joining CCSI, she worked at the International Energy Agency on energy efficiency and demand-side measures to reduce fossil fuel dependence. We also have Ben Baraga, who was the lead author of the report. Ben is a program associate at CCSI, specializing in investment governance, the circular economy, and the clean energy transition. He received a BA in public policy analysis and environmental analysis from Pomona College and has spent the past 2 years at CCSI contributing to market assessments and investment guides across the diverse sectors of critical minerals, agriculture, and HVAC. And Laura and Ben will be joined by Adam Dykstra, the co-founder and president of FM Hero, a refrigerant tracking and management solution provider that helps make refrigerant management really a whole lot easier for all of us. And Adam has a long history in refrigerants and HVAC and will provide some insights throughout the discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura. Thank you so much for joining us and hosting this for with REEF today.
Thank you, Alicia, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today in what I hope to be an enriching and very engaged conversation. Very quickly, I want to say a few words on CCSI. The Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an applied research center sitting at Columbia University Climate School that focuses on how investment, regulation, policy, finance, and private sector action can be better aligned with sustainable development and climate goals. A core part of our work focuses on systems-level decarbonization within energy transition goals. And HVAC is a good example of why that systems-level approach or lens matters and why we at CCSI decided to embark on this research journey. Heating and cooling demand is rising quickly, especially as climate change increases, heat stress, and buildings electrify. And that places HVAC squarely within the built environment decarbonization levers. If the built environment sector scales without careful consideration, we risk reducing emissions in one place while we are increasing them elsewhere through grid stress, inefficient equipment, refrigerant leakage, or poor end-of-life management. So there is already excellent work, data, and research on HVAC, cooling, access, and refrigerants out there by the real experts on these issues, including by great organizations such as REEF. But what we saw, however, is that conversations around refrigerant transition, refrigerant recovery, and energy efficiency are often treated separately, as Alicia was saying earlier. And this is where we saw an opportunity to dive deeper into the very much needed coordination and systems level approach to HVAC decarbonization. So I'm going to welcome my colleague and main author of our report, Ben Baraga, to introduce the concept of refrigerant circularity and efficiency nexus.
Thanks so much, Laura, and hello, everyone. I'm going to give a brief snapshot of the three components of the Nexus before we jump into refrigerant transition and subsequently the rest of them for a brief deep dive, including your comments. So just to quickly give this snapshot, the first pillar is looking to describe the harm of refrigerant emissions. So we're looking to reduce not only the global warming potential of refrigerants that are potentially leaking from HVAC equipment, but also new threats such as PFAS content in these emissions as well. The second pillar is similar but different in that it's looking to reduce the quantity rather than the harm of refrigerants. So we're looking to keep this equipment being a closed loop to reduce leakage and end-of-life disposal and venting. And that third bullet point, energy efficiency, we acknowledge is a little bit more well-developed and well-recognized throughout the industry. However, we want to make an effort to fold in these first two pillars into this conversation about a heat pump transition and energy efficiency upgrades overall. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the refrigerant transition pillar. And we always like to start off, or at least we do in the paper, with setting some context. This is a timeline that you may find familiar in that there are those 4 generations of refrigerants. The first one starting out, funnily enough, with natural refrigerants. They were initially used, and we're going to recommend using them again. But at this point, equipment and technology hadn't caught up to make them fully safe and reliable, leading to this second generation, which of course ushered in CFCs and HCFCs. You can see this red bubble here is ozone depletion potential, with one being the greatest. So we start to see trade-offs coming in, and there's almost a trade-off in every single generation where, you know, we're increasing the safety and durability and reliability of refrigerants, but we're also trading that off with, of course, ozone depletion. And we see a widespread policy instrument called the Montreal Protocol to phase down the use of CFCs and HCFCs and usher in a new generation of predominantly HFCs. Once again, the trade-off is that you've solved ozone depletion, but you've left bare the issue of global warming potential. And for those that don't know, this is essentially saying, you know, it's essentially for example, with R410A, we're looking at over 100 years. This is over 2,000 times the potency of CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So we still have that issue of global warming that the refrigerants are causing, the leakage is causing, and of course that leads to the Kigali Amendment in 2016, which begins to phase down this and kicks off this transition that we're still in the midst of today. And that leads us to the point here and why we're here today. This 4th generation is looking a lot more diverse than the previous ones. There's an option to go with the synthetic refrigerants, this new generation of HFOs, or we can go with the natural refrigerants towards the bottom here. And one thing that we've sort of added into the conversation or tried to within this broader, more accepted narrative is the PFAS bubble, especially 1234YF degrades 100% into PFAS called TFA. And then you can see that also present as well in its blends. And so we're just looking to identify, once again, these harms and chart the course so that this next transition is more sustainable. And that's what we're getting at with this pillar, is what makes a refrigerant transition sustainable so that companies don't have to get caught off guard by a large-scale legislation change or just a complete paradigm shift within the industry. Well, we want to make sure that these, and these are the points that we hit on in our paper, a public roadmap, one that outlines the choices that are being made. Even if you decide that HFO is the best option for your company right now, we want you to acknowledge the PFAS threat and put that trade-off for everyone to see, essentially. And we weren't seeing that as much in our research so far. What we advocate for is ultra low GWP and PFAS-free refrigerants, and that ends up being natural refrigerants, especially hydrocarbons and CO2. And then, of course, we want a policy stance that's not going to be impeding the introduction of those refrigerants and making the enabling environment as much as possible, adding to rather than inhibiting that process. And so on that last point of PFAS, just because, once again, it's a little bit underreported, we want to put a fine point on the fact that, like I said, 1234, it's not only goes into a more popular in the North American market, 454B and A, it degrades into TFA. TFA is a type of forever chemical that's eluded regulation so far. It's relatively smaller than some of the earlier regulated types of PFASs that have been phased out. However, the fact that they're forever means that there's an inevitability to their accumulation over time. And we start to see, especially in the EU, conversations surrounding the fact that 1234YF is accumulating in the atmosphere, it's accumulating in water over even just the past decade. And we're not trying to say that, this is coming next year. It's certainly not, it's a ways away, but when we're charting a course and we're seeing what could be this next transition shift, like we were looking at in the timeline, PFAS comes up as one of those next potential issues that there isn't quite a workaround for, in the way that the cons of natural refrigerants can be planned around. And so we just want to put up a simple table here demonstrating that point. I didn't talk too much about R32, but it's sort of this transition refrigerant in the same way 454B is, in that it complies with the Kigali Amendment, but it still has, you can't call 675 GWP ultra low. And it's, the bottom line being, it's susceptible to more stringent regulations in the future, and that's what we're trying to provide a forward-looking stance for. And this trade-off, the fact that there's a resolution to refrigerants like hydrocarbons, where we're starting to already see EU regulations become more nuanced with the concept of flammability in advanced technology, and designing equipment for CO2 as well. These are the types of refrigerants that we're hoping will allow the industry to remain more flexible and open to not just regulation, but the enforcement of this regulation that's coming down the line. So with that, we wanted to just, we're going to add in this slide before every poll, just because I know I didn't know how to respond to a poll before we did this webinar. So just as a reminder to open up the polls section before we switch into this, and I see that it just became live. We've got 4 questions for you off the bat before we transition to the circularity side of things. And I'm going to open this up myself as well so that I can see the responses. But first, we want to get to know who you are and what you do, just to get a read of the room. Where are you coming from? I'm seeing public sector, NGO, other. Would love to hear more in the chat or in the Q&A function. If you have a question, be sure to say where you're coming from if you decide. Moving on to our substantive question, and Jamie, I think we're going to roll these out one by one, but how do you see organizations approaching refrigerant selection in your experience? So maybe you work with maybe you work for an organization that's that has this refrigerant selection criteria. Maybe you you partner with an organization, or you're a researcher like us who you've also gotten a lay of the land. Would love to see, just compare notes. What are you seeing out in the industry today? Seeing a lot of compliance driven only, which makes sense. No formal criteria, interesting as well. I think also, maybe we can just move on to the next one and make sure everyone has a chance, because I want to be mindful of time. But this is the meatiest one. What do you see as the biggest barrier to a refrigerant transition? I know we can't cover all of the possible barriers, but we tried to cover a lot of the most important ones we saw. And I know it's hard to choose one, but if you had to pick, that's seeing a lot of increasing cost of replacement. Yeah, of course. seeing that one getting an early majority. And maybe let's close out with, what do you think would be most helpful to organizations in advancing refrigerant transition goals? This is just so that it becomes solutions oriented. We want to outline the issue, of course, but also we want to get an idea. Part of this framework is to have a conversation that addresses all three of the pillars. And we're starting with this one, but I also wanted to give an opportunity to Adam to jump in. I wanted to ask if, especially for that third question about the biggest barriers, is that surprising at all that most people have flocked to increased cost, also with a lack of trained personnel being in second place? Any comments on that, Adam, before we move on?
No, I mean, I would say that's no surprise. We do a lot of work with HVAC Excellence, the ESCO organization, and their whole mantra is raising the level of education in the marketplace. And there's been a lot of change in technological advancement. With, now we're into what's coming out today is the R32s, 454Bs, and so on, and that requires new hardware and new understanding. And so there's a lot for a new technician coming in to learn not only how the physical properties work of this equipment, but now all the technical electronic componentry to protect for safety issues, pressure issues, and so on. I mean, your air conditioner is run on a computer now. It's not just an on-off switch. And so I think that the training is a big one, and of course cost goes with it. So it's not surprising that those are right at the top of the list.
Great. Yeah, that's a good point. I see some hands raised also. I think we're going to move on and save. But trust me, we have a planned discussion towards the end, but I want to make sure that we give enough time for the rest of the pillars. That's the whole point of the Nexus. So I'm gonna move on to the circularity pillar and hand it over to my colleague Laura. Thank you, by the way, Adam, for joining us, and thank you to everyone for responding to the poll so far.
Great, thank you, Ben. Okay, I now want to jump to refrigerant circularity as the second pillar of our refrigerant circularity efficiency nexus. The central argument here is that refrigerant transition matters because it reduces the harm caused by each kilogram or ton of refrigerant that escapes. But circularity matters because it reduces how much refrigerant escapes in the first place. If we only change the refrigerant but continue to lose it through poor installation, servicing, disposal, we leave a major emissions opportunity on the table. Next slide, please. Refrigerant emissions are very difficult to measure precisely because they occur across many dispersed points in the equipment life cycle: installation, operation, maintenance, accidents, and end-of-life disposal. Yet the available evidence still points to a substantial circularity gap. In 2024, out of an estimated 230 million metric tons of refrigerant consumed in the United States, only about 9 million was recovered. That's only roughly 4%. The precise number in this data point may be debated, but the direction of the whole data point is clear, which is what should function much more as a closed loop is still operating as a largely linear system. And this is why circularity is not secondary to refrigerant transition, or should not be secondary to refrigerant transition or to energy consumption, which we'll cover more in depth when we get to energy efficiency. Next slide, please, Ben. This pillar matters, as I was saying, because refrigerant transition and refrigerant circularity answer two different questions. Refrigerant transition, as Ben was telling us, speaks to how harmful the emissions are if refrigerant is released into the atmosphere. On the other hand, refrigerant circularity speaks to how much refrigerant is released, the quantity, and how to prevent that leakage. Both are necessary because during periods of transition, as the ones we're facing now, companies and regulators often focus on new equipment and new refrigerants, but legacy equipment remains in the field for years. If that equipment is not properly serviced, not properly decommissioned, the benefits of these transition are diluted. It also matters because on top of that, circularity creates commercial value by enabling an additional source of refrigerant supply through reclaimed refrigerants, reducing life cycle costs and regulatory risk, and generating immediate emission reductions while the long-term refrigerant transitions are still underway. So what does ideal refrigerant circularity look like? We have defined it as a practical set of strategies that prevent refrigerant leakage and keep valuable refrigerant in productive use by returning it to the value chain through recovery, reclamation, and reuse of refrigerants at end of life. Some of these practices include better maintenance and monitoring, which prevent leakage, building data systems and traceability, which help companies actually know where the refrigerants are going and what's happening with the refrigerants. A key lever is also investing in technician and training capacity, which we actually found to be a key gap, which I'll talk a little bit more and hope that Adam can tell us much more about that. Other levers include minimizing refrigerant charge size through better system design and educating consumers before disposal happens, not after. Regarding our key gaps, the main barriers to circularity are not just technical. For contractors and technicians, a key gap, as I was saying, is the lack of standardized and continuously updated training. This matters because outdated practices can persist for years, especially when certification does not require any renewal or continuing education from a regulatory standpoint. One persistent misconception here is that using reclaimed refrigerant can void equipment warranties, which is not true. For consumers, the gap is even more basic. Many consumers do not know why refrigerant recovery matters and think that reclaimed refrigerants perform worse than virgin refrigerants. And these misconceptions on the consumer front are even worse in the US, where most consumers don't even know that technicians are required to recover refrigerants, that improper venting is illegal, or that leaking systems actually consume more energy and raise energy bills. So this ends up in a situation where the cost of the service is often more visible than the environmental harm of refrigerant leakage, and the underlying issue is constantly missed from the consumer standpoint. At the industry level, weak enforcement and fragmented regulation send the wrong signal to companies all the time. If stakes appear to be low, then recovery remains optional in practice. So circularity will not scale only through technical fixes or technological advancements. It also requires clear, practical education for consumers at the moments when they decide to repair, replace, or dispose of their equipment. It also requires technician capacity building and improvement in the enforcement of current regulations. The good news, and we can go to the next slide for the good news, is that the private sector is already implementing some solutions, and these solutions are helping to improve circularity practices. Servitization business models, such as cooling as a service models, can improve access to high efficiency products while giving providers a very strong incentive to maintain the equipment and recover the refrigerants at the end of life. Dakin's pilot program in Tanzania is one example of this kind of model that has been working and providing good circularity results. Technician-facing digital tools such as FM Hero can reduce paperwork burdens, improve compliance by making recovery easier for everyone and also easier to document. Specialized refrigerant management companies such as AGAS can also take pressure off manufacturers and OEMs and building owners by handling themselves the recovery, reclamation, and lifecycle refrigerant management as a third party. These examples actually show that circularity does not require every OEM to build everything internally. Partnerships can be a very credible pathway to improve circularity. The practical takeaway that I want to leave you with before we move to learning from you and moving to our poll is that refrigerant circularity should be treated as a core business capability, not as a peripheral sustainability initiative. A front-runner company should design equipment for longevity and low leakage. It should also support technicians with tools and training, and it should create or partner with another organization in recovery and reclaim systems and make end-of-life options visible to end consumers. And this is not simply to comply with regulation, but also as a competitiveness strategy where circularity can actually create a commercial edge to the business. Well, I think you're all familiar now with how our polls work. So if you can please return to our poll feature, and we already have our first question live here, which is, in your experience, which circularity practice do you believe to be the least developed right now? And this comes from what I just said before. And here for these section, I want to bring Adam very quickly into the conversation. And Adam, if you can talk a little bit while we get answers to this and all of our questions that you can see there. If you can talk a little bit about how recovery is looking now, and what are the main barriers to implementing some of the circularity practices that that we just talked about.
Yeah, you're singing my life song. So for those who don't know, I started Rapid Recovery, the world's largest refrigerant recovery company, in 2002. And sold that to AGAS. It was also on one of your slide a minute ago. In 2016, worked with them to bring it globally. At that time, it was just in the US. And so I've spent most of my life dealing with recovery and then documenting not just the recovery, but all refrigerant movements at this point. So I would say, the largest challenge, to be blunt, is a culture issue. We have a culture of technicians who think it's a waste of time. It's too much work. I have to carry heavy cylinders. I have to, spend all this time waiting and waiting and waiting. And there are practices that can help them, but the message is hard to get through to them because there's so many layers. And so we have organizations like HVAC Excellence, like I mentioned earlier, at the ESCO Institute, working to do that. We're working with manufacturers who are helping technicians learn how to recover faster, so that they're not waiting as long. I was just on a call this morning with Hardy, which is the wholesale association. We were talking about recovery rates and the need for them to come up, or we'll have a supply problem. And so it's really a culture shift, I think, is the most significant factor, is helping technicians really understand. It sounds really blunt, but a lot of folks still have this idea that they don't believe in climate change, right? There's a roughneck kind of group, and while that might be their belief, this is a renewable resource. It's a stewardship issue, and if we don't recover it, we won't have it to provide to our clients. My mom, when her air conditioner breaks in 3 years, won't be able to get refrigerant through her contractor because it's not available, because the supply has been restricted and nobody's been recovering, or not nobody. There hasn't been enough recovery into the circularity concept. We see that in the data. You've presented the data. That 4% number is hotly debated in the industry, but you're right in line. That's right where everybody lands. So obviously I said that I agreed with it when you were writing it, but that's what our data shows as well. And it needs to change. And I think there's a lot of this kind of an environment helps with that. But for all those of you on the call, we need to talk about it a lot. We need to help homeowners understand it. We need to help contractors understand it. We need everybody in the entire ecosystem to understand it matters. This stuff should never wear out, should never go away. I mean, it should never hit the atmosphere. So it could be reused forever if we did a really good job. Obviously, that's not practical. Things leak and things go wrong. But in concept, it's a fully renewable resource, and we need to treat it that way.
Yeah, that's you're absolutely right. And I also wanted to try to convey that at some point through the presentation, which is recovery. I mean, of course, there are all of these environmental problems that can be solved through recovery, but beyond the environmental implications and benefits that recovery and circularity practices have in this space, there's also the supply issue and how just implementing these practices can just improve supply and provide an additional supply source for refrigerants. So that's very insightful. I wanted to give people a little nudge to continue to respond. Our 4 questions in the poll are already live, and I see we have more votes in the first one than the other ones. So just a very quick reminder that our 4 questions are live, so you can go through them. And while you do that, very quickly, Adam, what do you think about maybe the choice of manufacturers and OEMs choosing to do the recovery themselves or trying to partner with other organizations? How does partnership in this space look like, and do you see any benefits to doing that, or how do you see it's more effective to come about the recovery question if you're starting to join the circularity team?
Man, that's a tough question. I don't know that the manufacturers can live in that space. They're too disconnected from their equipment once it leaves their factory, then their wholesaler and the contractor, and then it just lives in the wild, and they don't get to see it again. And I do think that partnerships between the reclamation space, third-party recovery, but also through educational sources is important. Ultimately, there are only 2 really good movers. One is as a stick, and that is enforcement. And then the other is an economic incentive, which is increasing the value of the refrigerant to the point where it's worth so much. Why would I ever let it go? And there are levers and possibilities in there from a regulatory perspective and from a strictly capital society. We live in a capital world, so there are ways to make that happen outside of that. But those are the 2 big movers, and I do see folks like Daikin and Trane, Lennox, and many of the big OEMs are actually working really hard to try to figure out how to improve this because they see the problem. And it's unfortunate it's taken 30 years to get to this point where we're all talking about this regularly. But it's going to take another who knows how many, but enough push from all of us to get it to become mainstream discussion. I don't know if people remember back in the day when the Montreal Protocol first came out. I was a little kid, and I remember crushing styrofoam cups was like this horrible, evil thing because it was letting CFCs into the atmosphere. We need to get to that spot where I look at my home air conditioner the same way and say, hey, I want my technician to really do a good job because that's worse than that styrofoam cup was. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for your insights. I really wanted to get your thoughts because you are doing amazing work in this space already, and getting awareness, as you said, as we tried also to convey through our paper and through this presentation, is the first step actually to get moving on circularity. I will thank you everyone also for voting and for participating in the polls. As Ben said earlier, we will have some time to have an open discussion for people who were raising their hands. Please do send your name and into the Q&A feature so we know that you want to speak at the end of the session, so we can unmute you and invite you to come in with comments. In the meantime, Ben, I'll pass it on to you to speak about our last pillar of the Nexus.
Thanks so much, Laura and Adam. I'm gonna try to move pretty quickly so that we have this time for discussion. And lucky for me, I think the good part about presenting these pillars sequentially is that we've been talking about all three of them throughout. So there's not as much to say by the end here. Hopefully you've been following along. And I think also what's great about following up from the poll and from Adam's insights about this culture shift and finding consensus on a point. Energy efficiency in the HVAC sector seems to be the closest of the three pillars from our estimation. The fact that there's a consensus, efficiency piece of equipment that companies across the board are trying to implement more of. The International Energy Agency has called for tripling their capacity by 2030. We have a concrete goal, and it's not really our place to be completely just restating what they've been saying. More so, we want to emphasize how those first two pillars fit into this conversation, because we know that they make huge cuts when replacing gas boilers, conventional furnaces in the heating space. You see this big chunk of the building sector makes up, which in turn makes up a big chunk of the emissions around the world. And they're also more efficient than a lot of the conventional cooling equipment as well. So again, moving through to sort of where they start to fit together. Obviously, if we're replacing gas boilers, conventional furnaces that maybe aren't using conventional refrigerants, and we're introducing this device that does leak just like any other piece of equipment that uses refrigerants, we're introducing a lot more refrigerants into the world, and a lot more equipment that we need to make sure that both the harm and the quantity of these refrigerants are being reduced, are being pushed down. And also refrigerants, that conversation along with energy efficiency starts to get a little bit tenuous in terms of the misconceptions. I mentioned trade-offs before, and of course there's the trade-offs of flammability with hydrocarbons, but also, especially around when the Kigali Amendment went live, there was a lot of conversation about, okay, well, natural refrigerants, it's great, they're low impact, but what's going to be their effect on efficiency? And so we wanted to take a moment to sort of discuss the recent studies that are coming out. This graph is from a 2025 study on heat pumps and refrigerant choice, and just kind of goes to show that the metrics are looking good in terms of the circled refrigerants here. These are all hydrocarbons. They're right on par with R32. Something also to mention is that the HFO that breaks down into TFA, PFAS, is actually being outcompeted in terms of seasonal coefficient of performance. So again, new data, this stuff is coming out that efficiency isn't actually going to be one of those trade-offs that need to be considered, especially when going with hydrocarbons here. And that also brings us to the point of this call as well, getting more up-to-date industry perspectives. Obviously, a decade ago, that was a big question about, is efficiency going to be a sacrifice? There was a great study that came out just last year in South Korea, polling industry stakeholders about what they think the biggest barrier is going to be to, similar to what we're asking, to the low GWP transition. And actually decreasing energy efficiency was one of their least concerns. So the tides might be changing. Maybe that's not as big of an issue, but if that's true, then that should be really, shouted from the rooftops, in that, this type of thing that we see that consumers have misconceptions about all sorts of things, and so being clearer on that stance just takes away one more barrier to that transition aspect. Also wanted to mention leakage as well, because on that last graph, R32 is right up there with it. So there's the question of why go the extra mile to natural refrigerants? We thought this study was so great because this is from the same paper, and now the energy demand is grayed out, and instead we're looking at the emphasis on leakage and recovery and venting. This here on the y-axis is total equivalent warming impact. So it's looking at the full environmental impact of, give or take, of the life cycle emissions of a piece of equipment with that refrigerant in it. And again, this is looking at heat pumps, and that's where 32 gets edged out. when it does escape the heat pump, it's going right into the atmosphere, and it may be low, but it's not ultra low. There's data from the California Air Resource Board that's showing that, yeah, plenty of heat pumps today are having their refrigerants vented, whether intentionally or unintentionally, at end of life. And if that happens, it's actually calculated that you would be better off with skipping the transition and just keeping your conventional furnace and AC unit, because you are, if you're using still like 410A, that is making up that impact. And the last thing to say here is, once again, it's another reason to keep emphasizing PFAS, because even this whole life cycle emissions calculation that's very nuanced and inspired a lot of what we built our Nexus around, direct versus indirect emissions, it's still not accounting for PFAS, of course. It's just not, and rightfully so, it's not in that same conversation about global warming potential. However, if we're looking at the full environmental impact, we have to crowd in all of these other environmental concerns, such as PFAS, and that's where, conspicuously the HFO doesn't have this baggage, even though it's less efficient. But we need to keep in mind the PFAS angle as well. So just wanted to sort of end on that note before moving on to our final poll. I think maybe we can go through this one more quickly. Jamie, if you want to just open up both, and this is just more of a reflective 2 poll questions that we wanted to get to before getting into the Nexus and the discussion aspect. But we really do want to see, especially this second question asking about, these concerns. These are the layered and nuanced concerns that lie at the heart of the Nexus, that are combining leakage with efficiency, with emissions and GWP concerns. And so we really want to know, like, which one has been on your mind. Maybe we didn't convince you, in this short presentation. We'd be interested to see what you think of the full paper, but especially when thinking about what warrants further study. And as you can see, a lot of these studies are very new, that are looking at, how do we quantify and account for which refrigerant to choose in this transition space. So yeah, really just want to make sure we get your feedback on that. So I'm going to give it just a couple more seconds, and then I think I'm just going to jump right into our last couple slides so that we have a solid 7 or 8 minutes for hearing your questions. And I think also, we'll talk a bit more about the logistics later, but I'm seeing still some votes for natural refrigerants hindering energy efficiency. So that's really great feedback that we're getting. CapEx constraints, of course, is going to be a big one in heat pump transition. So yeah, thanks a lot. And once again, I think we're going to just roll right ahead to be mindful of everyone's time. Yeah, Laura, did you want to?
No, I just was agreeing that we maybe should go very quickly through the Nexus so we can open up the mic for people who are eager to participate.
Totally. Yeah, so this, and the best part about this, as I said, is it's all pretty much review. And we include these slides at the end just to jog your memory of, what have we talked about. But again, you've seen this slide before: ultra low GWP, PFAS-free, reclaim and recovery and reuse, end of life recovery for circularity, and then of course the deployment of heat pumps with those first 2 pillars in mind. And it's all because these are mutually reinforcing actions, and they can also lead to detriment to if one is not considered. So lock in stranded assets, increase retrofitting costs, and delaying subsequent transitions, and sort of muddying the waters of what should be prioritized next. These are the types of things we're trying to avoid by including them all in the same conversation. And the last note that we want to hit on is just that, kind of alluded to it before, we present a framework of thinking, but obviously we want this to be something that's actionable as well. And really, in the paper, we advocate for a coherent transition plan that companies can undertake, especially OEMs and distributors, in terms of, a lot of them have great sustainability web pages and sustainability annual reports, but the extent to which each of these important subjects are being weighed within those, it all starts at the planning phase in terms of how are we laying out a strategic ambition, how are we setting targets, how are those targets being implemented, how are we engaging to see the effects of those changes, and then of course governance is that last point. So just sort of advocating for that as well before moving on to the final poll, which will lead into our discussion. I know it's a lot of polls, so we really appreciate you guys sticking with us. And so it kind of comes to a head here. Which of the pillars do you think needs the most support right now? That's kind of the $1 million question, I know, and we're not really asserting that ourselves as well, but really just looking to see what your thoughts are. Let me just open that up. Yeah, Laura.
And in the meantime, I wanted to also say, just conscious of time, that if we are not able to cover all your questions through our final minutes of discussion, please do still send them through our Q&A feature, because we will definitely follow up with some answers. We want to process all of the information that we have been gathering through the polls and share back with you, with all the audience present and not present today. And so that gives us also an opportunity to answer your questions or comment on your comments. So please do feel free to start sending questions and with your name into the Q&A feature, so we can be aware of your questions or your comments, your participation, and we can respond either right now or in separately on offline basis.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, that's perfect. I think we should probably just start opening up.
Yes.
In terms of, and we have a couple of set questions for, in case none come to mind. I know we have a couple in the Q&A, and I'm just going to go ahead and open that up here if I can navigate to it. I don't know if we're going to have time for people to come off mute and physically ask the questions. But then again, I'm seeing Richard, just a comment. That sounds really interesting. Richard says that he'd like to share data in terms of emissions data. Sorry, I'm going to move to the questions here. How do we address the reservations against transition to ammonia-based refrigerant system? They say it's complex to handle in industrial setup. Ammonia is what we've covered a little bit less in our paper, so I think that's just like again, it's what we're here for. We wanted to know specifically which natural refrigerants, what type of feedback they were getting from. Obviously, ammonia isn't being looked into for the residential application because there are toxicity concerns, and we're aware of that. But otherwise, we saw efficiency data that brings it on par. So that's what we have for ammonia, and definitely noted that that there is a concern there as well.
Richard, if you would like to unmute yourself, or Jamie, we can help Richard unmute himself and just jump in with your comments and the data that you have been gathering, which seems very interesting. Please do come forward. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, good. Yeah, we're looking at something different. Refrigerant leakage is one aspect of direct emissions. However, we're looking at the problem of dirty coils in refrigeration and air conditioning equipment. If you have a dirty clogged coil, it can't reject the heat. The energy consumption goes up. My email is richard@coilpod. If one or more of you can send me an email, I'll send you back a study from 2018 by the Carbon Trust that basically estimated that the entire HVAC-R sector is consuming 25% more electric than it should because of dirty coils. The emissions are 0.5 gigatons a year, which is 38% of the gigaton emissions from refrigerant leakage. So you'll get an extra close to 40% bang for the buck in indirect emissions reduction if you clean your coils. And this is not being discussed by anybody in the HVAC-R sector. And we've been studying for the last 10 years.
That's great. That's a great insight. And thank you so much for sharing, Richard. And we will make sure to reach out separately, of course.
Good.
And here is also our info. If you or anyone else wants to reach out and keep in touch and continue these conversations.
Yeah.
That's,
I have one more comment. Are you folks aware that there's going to be a natural refrigerants convention in Tarrytown, New York?
Yes, we are. We are unfortunately not going to be able to come this year, but we are very aware, and we would love to gather thoughts also from that convention and see what people are talking about and how to contribute to that conversation. But thank you so much for
You're welcome.
Making that aware for us. And what you're saying resonates a lot, and I think it connects to the importance of looking at HVAC if through a system level lens, and how maintenance is a key part of circularity. And circularity is, we often, when we talk about circularity, think exclusively about recycling or in this case, in the case of refrigerants, recovery and reclaiming of refrigerants. But circularity, it means much more beyond just reclaiming and recovering, and involves maintenance and making sure that whatever equipment we have in place right now, we maintain, so we prevent leakage and energy losses. So thank you so much for your comment, Richard. That was very, very on point with what we are trying to convey here. I'm going to go through one last question, conscious that we just have 1 minute left. Which reads, how should regulators and industry account for the reality that the supply of high GWP refrigerants cannot disappear overnight, given the long operating lifespans of existing HVAC systems that will continue to require service, maintenance, recovery, reclamation, and responsible end-of-life management? I think that is that speaks exactly to our circularity pillar, which, in my opinion, and this we will just try to compare this with your own responses on which pillar needs the most support. In my personal opinion, I think the circularity pillar is the one that needs most support, because it's the one that is less talked about currently, and which is lacking most awareness. And I think circularity practices and circularity awareness is a pathway to address this, whoever asked this question. Because, of course, these legacy equipment that still have high GWP refrigerants are still there and will continue to be there. And the way to tackle those refrigerants and to address that situation is by making sure that we are maintaining them to prevent leakage. We're disposing of these equipment when the time comes in the right manner, and we are recovering and reclaiming those refrigerants to dispose of them as well in the right way, to prevent them to leak into the atmosphere. So I think circularity will hopefully address that question when the time comes. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here, for joining us, for actively participating in our excessive polling. And we will make sure to reach out to follow up with the questions that we couldn't answer today here, and to process all of these information and continue the conversation that we think is important into looking at HVAC decarbonization through a system level lens that connects the three pillars that we talked about today: energy efficiency, refrigerant transition, and circularity. Thank you, Adam, so much for bringing your amazing insights today as well. And thank you again to REEF for this space and for inviting us today to share our research. Please do reach out if you want to continue the conversation with us. Otherwise, you will hear from us.
Thank you. Good job, Laura and Ben. Nice work.
Thank you. Hope to see you all soon.